Mexico, 1487. A handful of priests prepares for a monumental task.
Over 100 feet above me, there once stood an altar. In a 4-day period, 20,000 people were killed here in a bloodbath of ritual sacrifice.
It is the largest human sacrifice ever recorded in history.
But is this gruesome tale a true piece of Aztec history?
I think it's highly likely that the heart would have still been beating when it was removed from the chest.
Or is it Spanish propaganda?
I think that number is completely exaggerated.
Now, we travel to the heart of a lost empire. Rebuild a conquered city.
Go.
Calculate the scale of human sacrifice.
This was remarkably easy.
Now that was a cut. This is 6 inches deep.
And refight the Aztecs' final battle on unsolved history. In an operating room in Australia, preparations are underway for a surgery that could change history.
This would have collapsed both lungs.
Dr. Brendan Coventry has performed thousands of surgeries, but this is no ordinary procedure. Today, he's trading steel scalpel for rough-hewn flint knife and is about to open up a mystery that traces back 500 years to the other side of the world. Mexico City. This is the Zócalo Square. The Central Cathedral and the Presidential Palace make this the heart of a vast city of 20 million people. But hidden beneath these cobblestone streets is a lost civilization. 500 years ago, this was the heart of another city, Tenochtitlan, the capital of the great Aztec Empire.
At the time the Spaniards arrived in 1519, the Aztec Empire was the largest and most powerful empire that Mesoamerica had ever known.
At its peak, their empire stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. Historians estimate that the Aztecs dominated almost 10 million subjects. They built a capital, Tenochtitlan, in the center of a lake. And at its center was an imposing structure, 12 stories high, El Templo Mayor.
The Aztec Great Temple was the place where official religion was put on display, as it was not possible to put on any place else in the whole empire.
The Aztecs were deeply religious, but their religion demanded a hefty price. It was a price of human blood and human hearts. Their priests performed human sacrifice at the Templo Mayor so often that its steps were permanently stained with blood.
Blood was sacred. Blood was the most precious thing that you had to give. And that's why it was so often given to the gods.
Sacrifice was necessary in the Aztec view in order to keep the sun rising every day, setting every evening, and coming up again the next day. In other words, it was necessary to sustain life here on Earth.
When Spanish explorer Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, he and his entourage of Catholic priests were outraged to discover the true purpose of the Templo Mayor. Most shocking of all were the accounts they heard of the sacrificial ritual of 1487, one of unthinkable proportions. In a 4-day period, records tell as many as 20,000 men were brought to the city, laid across the altar, and had their beating hearts ripped out.
The 1487 event is fascinating because it is the largest human sacrifice ever recorded in history.
Did this bloody ritual really take place? Or did the Spanish exaggerate the scale of the event to demonize the Aztecs and justify the annihilation of their empire?
I think that number is completely exaggerated. I cannot know how many people were killed, maybe more than 1,000, maybe 2,000.
Now, Unsolved History is about to bring the ruins of the Aztecs back to life. We'll search for the truth about the mass sacrifice of 1487, and we'll investigate the historic clash of cultures that occurred in its shadow. How did a band of Spanish brigands bring down an army 100 times its size? Did the Aztecs' brutal ritual cause their own demise? By combining anthropology with 21st century technology, Unsolved History's team of experts will take us back 500 years to reveal the truth about these events. Anthropologists Francis Berdan and Barry Isaac. Weapons experts Ross Hassig and Jack Schultz. Artificial torso designers Wesley Fisk and Chris Lee. Surgeon Dr. Brendan Coventry. To understand what happened here, we have to understand how the Aztecs lived. An important link to that is Hernan Cortez and his army of 300 Spanish conquistadors. They had come to Mexico seeking their fortune. After a 7-month trek, they reached a lakeshore, where they faced a remarkable sight. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan.
The best descriptions we get are from his soldiers. They were so awestruck that they thought they were in a dream.
Linked to shore by a perfectly straight causeway, stood a vast island city that put Europe's finest to shame. Dominating the skyline, a stone pyramid, the Great Temple, rose a staggering 12 stories.
It's bigger than anything they'd seen so far in Mexico. And this is a city of 250,000 people, way out of scale of what they'd already encountered. So it must have made your heart stop just for a moment to think of what they were actually walking into.
Not far from the city, they met Montezuma, king of the Aztecs. He had come to greet Cortez and offer him gifts of gold and fine jewels.
Cortez tries to embrace Montezuma, and all of Montezuma's high nobles, his aides, push Cortez back. This is inappropriate. This is not right. You can't do this. He's the most powerful man in their known world.
Both men represented powerful nations. Spain dominated Europe, and the Aztecs dominated central Mexico. It was inevitable that the two armies would clash. What is astounding is that the Spanish somehow won. That war all but wiped out Aztec civilization. Apart from these ruins, archaeologist Eduardo Matos has guided the dig at the Templo Mayor site since it was discovered in 1978.
We could see how many levels or sections had been constructed. We found the places where the offerings were located, and something very important. We understood the real symbolism of the Templo Mayor.
The Templo Mayor was the central focus of Aztec religion. What was disturbing was the vast number of sacrificial human remains. Matos is sensitive to what he feels is a macabre fascination with this side of Aztec culture.
We should clarify that human sacrifice existed in many previous societies. It existed during the Romans, and these sacrifices were practiced according to a religious belief in obtaining life on earth.
What's more important, according to Matos, is to appreciate the technological prowess of a culture that built such a magnificent temple complex.
Carlos, how extensive is this ruin up front of us here?
Well, this building was a very extensive one. It was called the House of the Eagles. But here we are looking at 30 meters, 35 meters
right.
width, and continues beneath this building from the colonial period.
And we go see that?
Yes, of course.
Just across the street from Templo Mayor, historian Daniel Martinez and archaeologist Carlos Gonzalez visit a newly discovered underground ruin.
Is this been restored, or is this the way it originally was?
Well, it has a work of restoration, but not reconstruction.
Okay.
I mean, what you are looking is just the building as it was found.
With no architectural drawings handed down from the Aztecs, archaeologists have struggled to envision the true splendor of Tenochtitlan.
It's difficult because Mexico City is a pre-Hispanic city buried under the modern city. So we can only know small parts of this sacred precinct. We cannot make yet a complete reconstruction.
Now, we're about to rebuild the sacred precinct, virtually. Using measurements from all the existing ruins in Mexico City and the architectural plans compiled by Eduardo Matos, our team of graphic engineers will model the sacred precinct with unprecedented accuracy.
Well, Daniel, here we are standing in front of the Templo Mayor of the Aztecs, and if we go back 500 years, then you can see how tall it was. It was a double temple because it had the temple of Huitzilopochtli on the right side, who was the particular god of the Aztecs,
right,
and the temple of Tlaloc on the left side. Tlaloc was the god of rain and one of the oldest gods in pre-Hispanic Mexico.
So for Aztecs here, this was the center of their world.
Oh, it was the center of the universe, according to their religious thought.
The Aztecs believed that the Great Temple was a man-made mountain that connected the heavens above to the underworld below. Every day, the priests climbed to the top of the temple and made an offering to their sun god, Huitzilopochtli. But was human sacrifice so important to the Aztecs that they were prepared to sacrifice 20,000 souls in just 4 days? Or have the rituals atop the Templo Mayor been twisted by Spanish historians? Get ready to experience one of the most shocking events in human history, just as the Aztecs did 500 years ago. In 1519, Hernán Cortés achieved the unthinkable. He'd crossed 250 miles of hostile Indian territory and was the first European explorer to walk into the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. But as he entered the sacred precinct, he found something utterly shocking: human blood and body parts strewn everywhere.
This was the most frightful thing they'd ever seen. Of course, they're in a strange land. There are very few of them. They were, of course, terrified.
Amazingly, within 1 week, Cortés executed a bloodless coup and took Montezuma prisoner. Eventually, after only a 22-month war, the Spanish defeated the Aztecs and transformed their religion to Christianity.
They built their own capital city, Mexico City, right on top of the ancient Tenochtitlan. They took the stones, basically, they raised the major buildings and used those stones for their own colonial buildings.
The Spanish not only destroyed Tenochtitlan, they burned many of the Aztec historical drawings, known as codices, to discover the truth about the Aztecs and to discover the true scale of the sacrifice that took place at Templo Mayor. Anthropologists must now turn to second-hand accounts written after the Spanish conquest.
There's a codex called the Codex Telleriano-Rimensis. It shows an image of that particular event, and it indicates 20,000 with glyphs. And these two little bags here indicate 8,000 apiece, the number 8,000. And these little tree-like affairs, they're actually hairs, they each indicate 400. So there are 10 of those, so that's 8,000, 8,000, and 4,000, that's 20,000 people.
Is this number correct? And if so, where could the Aztecs have procured 20,000 sacrificial victims? The answer to that tells us something important about the workings of the Aztec Empire. Captured enemy soldiers provided an easy supply of expendable souls.
At this time, the Aztec Empire was a really well-oiled war machine. It would not have been difficult for them to have gathered up 20,000 sacrificial offerings from around the empire. This is the bottom stage, the first stage of this pyramid. If this were an actual sacrifice, and you were the person to be sacrificed, you would be tied by your neck, and if you fainted or got rubbery legs, I would grab you by the hair and I would pull you up if I were your captor. At this point, 4 priests grab you and lay you across the sacrificial stone that way, and one up with each arm, one with each leg. A 5th priest would put a wooden yoke, they call it, over your neck and would stretch you taut to make your chest taut on this sacrificial stone. And then a priest with one swoop opens your chest with a flint knife and sever the arteries of the heart, and then he would hold up the still beating heart. He would offer it first to the god Huitzilopochtli, then he would turn and show it to each of the other 3 cardinal directions in turn, and then finally he would place the still beating heart in this receptacle. And at that point, the 4 priests who were holding your arms and legs would tumble your body down the steps, clear to the bottom.
But why 20,000 victims? What religious value could such a high number of sacrifices hold for the gods? Barry feels that the 1487 offering was not just a religious event.
This 1487 sacrifice had a political component as well as a religious component. Its aim, in a political sense, was one of shock and awe, because they invited foreign dignitaries, they invited the rulers of enemy states to come in and witness this event, which was the most spectacular sacrificial event that the Aztecs had ever put on.
It was obviously an intimidation as warrior after warrior after warrior becomes sacrificed, and it's a way to flaunt your powers.
This event was superbly organized. There was no shortage of priests to step in as replacements whenever a sacrificer priest became tired.
And there was no shortage of sacrificial sites. Besides 4 altars at Templo Mayor, the Aztec priests used 15 other sites throughout the city.
The reason for having as many altars as they did, and we are pretty sure they had 19, was to be able to accommodate a very large number of human sacrificial offerings in a single coordinated event spread over merely 4 days.
Spanish accounts speak of long lines of enemy captives that stretched from outside the sacred precinct all the way to the top of Templo Mayor. But still, how is it possible to sacrifice that many human beings in an orderly fashion? Barry has done the math.
If we assume that each sacrifice would have taken about 2 minutes, that means that 30 men would have been sacrificed at each altar per hour. Over 10 hours, this means that 300 men would have been sacrificed at each altar each day. We also know that there were 19 altars in use on this particular event. This gives us, if you multiply 1,200 by 19, you get 22,800. This is what makes the 20,000 figure believable.
But would 2 minutes be enough time for the priests to complete their ritual and cut out their victim's heart?
If you're thinking, say, 1 sacrifice every 2 minutes, I'd say that'd be much too fast. Once every 5 minutes, that's still fast.
The 2-minute interval is an assumption on my part. It would have to be tested by other means to see if that is a reasonable estimate of the amount of time.
Is Barry's theory possible? Could the Aztec priests have performed such an astonishing task? This unorthodox surgery is about to give us the answer. How many people were sacrificed during the 4-day offering of 1487? To discover how this cold-blooded act went down, we first have to find out exactly how fast an Aztec priest could remove a human heart. We must recreate their method of sacrifice precisely, beginning with the knife. The Aztecs constructed their ritual knives out of flint, the same way they made arrowheads and other weapons.
This is a sandstone hammer, and this will be used for percussion flaking in order to remove some really massive flakes. The idea is to begin removing flakes around the perimeter of this piece.
Starting with a large stone, professional flint knapper Jim Wynn will replicate the same Stone Age methods the Aztec artisans used.
And when you hear that crack, that's a good sound.
The process takes about 2 hours, and the result, quite effective.
The edges of that blade can be far sharper than even surgical steel, and they have used them in modern operations. They're so sharp that they do less damage to the tissue. This is the finished point, and we've got an Aztec sacrificial knife here. This should do the job.
But putting this Aztec ear knife to the use it was designed for is another matter. Human torsos are no longer available for sacrifice, so Unsolved History traveled to Adelaide, Australia, to get the help of an unusual organization. This is Anatomical Surrogate Technologies, a company that builds perfect replicas of the human body, so the military can study the damage caused by landmines. Designers Chris Lee and Wesley Fisk are going to build the surrogate torso from the inside out. Chris begins with a 3D computer model.
I need to see what the whole chest looks like with all the elements in place in 3 dimensions.
First, Chris must build the bony structure that protects the heart. Using a silicone mold, he constructs an exact replica of the sternum and then the rib cage around it.
The resins we've used to build the ribs and the intercostal cartilage behave in a very similar fashion to real ribs and cartilage.
To construct the chest cavity, they use a plaster mold which they will first line with skin.
The skin is actually real skin. It's a chamois-based product. It's had oils added to it, and it's been hydrated so that it really should perform just the same way as real skin. Now, as we're putting this skin in, we can actually smooth out the bubbles, and it will actually set in place. It's a very tricky material to work with, but we are in the process of trying to recreate the human body, so it's not an easy thing.
Beneath the layer of skin, there has to be thick muscle. Chris and Wes use a liquid gel to simulate this part of the chest.
We're pouring in a muscle replicant gel here, and it's something that actually performs in the same way as muscle would when it sets.
Like a giant Jell-O mold, they place the chest inside a refrigerator to harden the muscle gel.
Okay, now we've put the chest into the fridge at 4 degrees, and it'll stay there overnight, set, and we'll come back tomorrow morning and we'll see what the results are.
To find out how long it would have taken Aztec priests to perform their sacrificial operations, Unsolved History brought in a cancer surgeon who has opened up hundreds of real human chests, Dr. Brendan Coventry.
Excellent.
First, he must examine his unusual patient.
Tremendous.
Dr. Coventry oversees the final step, adding artificial organs into the chest cavity.
There'd be some difference between this model and a real human being, but really the differences are very small because Chris has tried to get everything as close as he can to the sort of strength and structure of a human body. So it's about as close as we can go. That should be fine.
Dr. Coventry makes sure that the heart is secured in the chest cavity with the aorta firmly attached.
That's a good position, Chris. I'm right up underneath the diaphragm, right up against the heart now. Good.
Before Dr. Coventry can begin the experiment, he must decide how he will take out the heart. He narrows it down to 2 different methods.
Well, the 2 different methods would most likely be through the sternum about here, where they would have to actually saw through the tough sternum and then divide around the chest between the ribs on each side.
The priest could then put his hand through the sternum and grab the heart. The second method would be to cut below the ribs and reach underneath the rib cage.
And then it would have been possible to cut through the diaphragm to gain entry to the heart cavity and thereby remove the heart.
The surgical team has constructed a bench that will simulate the Aztec sacrificial altar.
So presumably they lay on the stone and arch their back over like this.
The position of the victim is very important to the procedure.
We'll measure the angle. Putting this level.
Dr. Coventry measures the angle at which the victim's body would lay across the stone.
Yeah, it's about 30 degrees.
He then matches it to the angle that the torso will lie on the operating table.
Yes, gee, that's surprisingly steep, isn't it? That shows it's level now and it's showing 30 degrees.
The lifelike torso is put in place for the first approach. Dr. Coventry will cut across the sternum with the flint knife. Remember, if Barry Isaac's theory that 20,000 people were sacrificed at 19 separate altars in the course of 4 days is correct, our surgeon must cut out the heart in less than 2 minutes.
Go. 10. 30.
Tough as sternum. I don't believe the Aztecs do it this way.
50.
A little bit. Glad modern surgery not like this.
After 5 minutes, Dr. Coventry is forced to admit defeat.
I think if the Aztecs did it this way, they had another tool. They didn't use this tool to get through the sternum.
If the Aztecs really did perform the heart extraction in 2 minutes, this was not the way they did it. But we're not ready to throw out the historical record just yet. Dr. Coventry has one more chance to prove Barry's theory.
I don't think the Aztecs did it this way.
When Cortez entered the sacred precinct at the heart of the Aztec Empire in 1519, he faced a shocking sight. Human blood splattered everywhere. It was immediately obvious that Aztecs practiced human sacrifice. But the scale of that practice has remained one of history's great mysteries. Spanish clergy later recorded an account of a mass sacrificial ritual where upwards of 20,000 enemy warriors were put to death. Most historians are convinced the scale of this event has been exaggerated. But Unsolved History's investigation is about to find out for sure. To kill 20,000 people in 4 days, anthropologist Barry Isaac has calculated one ritual heart extraction had to be performed every 2 minutes.
Go.
Thanks to our unique experiment in medieval surgery, we're about to find out if that's possible.
5 minutes.
Having failed to cut through the sternum and extract the heart, Dr. Brendan Coventry brings out his second artificial patient and tries another approach. He will attempt to cut below the rib cage and reach up to grab the heart.
Go. 10. 20.
This was remarkably easy. It's far easier than I thought it would be.
To confirm the time of 20 seconds, Dr. Coventry decides to try the same approach again.
Go. 17. Faster.
I think it's quite quite feasible that the Aztecs were able to do this within a 2-minute period. They could put them across the altar and hold them down, carry out the whole procedure, and I think it's highly likely that the heart would have still been beating when it was removed from the chest.
Unsolved history has shown that 20,000 men could have been sacrificed in 4 days. That would leave another minute and a half for the various rituals that would have accompanied the 22nd heart extraction.
The heart had to then be offered to the god and to the other cardinal directions, and then placed in a repository, and then the body tumbled down the steps of the pyramid, and the sacrificer would then be ready for the next person. That would have required a very steady pace of human sacrifices.
But the sheer scale of this event begs another question. Why would these enemy soldiers calmly stand in line, waiting for such a horrific death? Why wouldn't they put up a fight?
Every soldier who went to war knew what his fate would be if he were captured, that his fate would be sacrifice. And every soldier also knew he would have an afterlife that was much more glorious as a sacrificial offering than he would ever have if he just died of natural causes.
All of the Indians believed that sacrifice was for the common good. Their blood would give the sun god strength to fight off the forces of night.
So human blood was the most precious thing they could give Huitzilopochtli, the sun, to make sure that, in fact, night would not be something that would encompass them forever.
They also believed in a glorious afterlife.
Soldiers who died at the sacrificial altar became celestial hummingbirds. They could come back and forth between the sky and the earth and suck the sweet nectar of flowers for an eternity.
While 20,000 is a shocking number of victims, Aztec historians point out it must be viewed in the context of modern warfare.
I think the Aztecs acted from their religious beliefs. In contrast, today, for example, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, well, they are actions that in a matter of a few seconds we have wiped out with the use of modern technology thousands upon thousands of people.
As a devout Catholic, Cortés must have been appalled by the pagan rituals he witnessed at Templo Mayor. Surely the Aztec priests would someday have to answer to his god. But at the time, the Aztecs were the most powerful empire in central Mexico. They had an army of over 100,000 well-trained soldiers, while Cortés had less than 1,000. How did he manage to defeat them? History books say that 3 factors caused the demise of the Aztecs. First, there was the crippling epidemic of smallpox that swept through the Indian population. That cuts the odds somewhat.
Weaponry is often brought as a factor in the conquest. The Spaniards had steel weapons, they had firearms, they had cannons.
Were these 2 remaining advantages, gunpowder and steel, really powerful enough to overcome the still overwhelming odds? Is the conventional history of the war between the Aztecs and the Spaniards correct? Unsolved History decided to put conventional history to the test with the help of weapons experts Ross Hassig, Jack Schultz, and Gary James.
This is a good proper 1500 period gun. It's what's called a matchlock. And the ignition is actually by this burning cord.
The Aztecs designed their shields to stop darts and arrows, not Spanish bullets.
It went all the way through. There's a real psychological effect to these things. You have this tremendous noise and fire.
Oh, man. There's this big flash of light that goes up in your face.
Spanish steel armor could withstand most Aztec weapons. But it didn't cover the whole body.
Actually, this is pretty typical of kills because most of the wounds that the Spaniards took were down the neck and under the arm and around the armor.
While gunpowder gave the Spanish a clear technological advantage in long-range exchanges, it was not a practical weapon for close contact.
The problem is how slow it was to load and reload, and having to then protect your marksmen before they were taken out by other weaponry from the native peoples.
In close quarters, the two armies used very different swords.
This is called a makwawit. It's a wooden sword. It was inset with very sharp obsidian blades. These are just like very, very sharp knives. Very brittle though, but extremely effective in cutting. It would be very effective, as you can imagine, as a slashing item, right? If you were to slash him, that would cut right through your arm.
Now that was a cut. You can see the cut in here easily, 6, 7 inches. Single blow cutting right through that.
Like easily lethal blows.
Easily.
Though not as powerful, the Spanish sword was faster and just as deadly. Steel swords also had an advantage against the Aztec Stone Age sword.
Yeah, you can see the damage here. We've lost almost our entire row of blades. The wood has been damaged beyond repair, but the impact really annihilated this weapon. This has an exceedingly sharp edge, razor sharp, but not very durable.
Close up, the two armies would have fought to a draw. And at longer range, gunfire was not enough to ensure Spanish victory, because the Indians had a deadly countermeasure: the sling.
Clearly lethal if you're unarmored.
Yeah, in the face, break the cheekbone, put him out of commission.
In a battle, there would have been thousands of these. So I think all in all, excellent weapon.
The Aztecs used perfectly rounded clay balls and stones as projectiles for the sling. They traveled at more than 150 miles per hour. Their consistent size and weight made them deadly accurate. Our tests have shown that the history of Spanish military superiority must have been written by armchair historians, not by those who had seen these 500-year-old weapons in action. So if Spanish firepower did not give them the key to tumbling the Aztec Empire, what did? For almost 100 years, the Aztecs ruled central Mexico. They were constantly at war, always expanding their empire. And with every victory, they demanded a ransom of victims for sacrifice to their gods.
There were very few defeats in Aztec history, so the Aztecs themselves had been extraordinarily successful as warriors.
But in 1519, Cortés arrived with an army of fewer than 600 mercenaries. 22 months later, the Spanish had defeated the Aztecs. How did they do it? The answer lies not on the battlefield, but in the Aztec system of government that was established once an enemy state was under their control.
When they conquered another city or region, they left the local leadership in place. The local leadership would then be responsible for maintaining control and policing themselves.
This meant that if the Aztecs showed weakness, their vassal tribes would rebel. In 1487, the Aztecs decided to send a message that unsolved history has proved was brutal fact, not bloody myth. They marched 20,000 enemy prisoners into Tenochtitlan and sacrificed all of them in just 4 days.
If a province rebelled, which was fairly common, the army would go in, reconquer, and they would take away the warriors for sacrifice.
The message was, do not rebel. We are now so strong that we can take your whole army and march them up the pyramid and sacrifice them.
But is it possible that the mass sacrifice of 1487 had the opposite effect? Did the Aztecs' dispassionate brutality toward their subjects end up spelling their downfall?
What had happened was that the Aztec Empire had failed to legitimate itself to its own people. In that sense, it is directly parallel to the present-day Soviet Union, which at the very first opportunity just disintegrated almost overnight.
Perhaps Cortez saw a weakness and exploited it. There were almost 60 different provinces that were dominated by the Aztecs, and many were willing to rebel against the oppressive regime.
This was an empire that was a war machine that conquered people and held them by terror.
Cortez was a very clever political strategist, military strategist. He knew divide and conquer. He saw that instantly.
So Cortez organized an alliance of Indian allies. He built a native army of 100,000 men, fueled by the desire for revenge against a hated rival.
They could see the advantage of Spanish arms. They saw a real possibility for defeating Aztec armies for the first time in their history.
Using guns and steel, like the tip of a sword, the Spanish would punch a hole in the front line, and then their Indian allies would flood through, turning the Aztec flanks and winning the battle.
The Spaniards were never numerous enough to be decisive in those battles, but they were numerous enough to make the difference between their armies, consisting mostly of Indians.
Surprisingly, the need for sacrifice also hindered the Aztecs on the battlefield.
One of the major goals in Aztec warfare was to capture enemies, not just kill them. If you captured an enemy and were able to then offer him up for sacrifice, you as a warrior gained social status.
The Spanish fought for one reason: intent to kill. This gave them a huge advantage.
This fellow, he's coming at you primarily with a goal to capture you, not to kill you. And we hear of much higher battlefield casualties among the native peoples than among the Spaniards.
Using European military strategy, Cortez surrounded Tenochtitlan with his native army and cut off the food and water supply. Eventually, with constant attacks, he wore down the Aztecs. And on August 13th, 1521, they surrendered.
So given the small number of Spaniards engaged in the conquest of Mexico, it's really an Indian conquest of other Indians, not a Spanish conquest of Indians. The Indians won the war, the Spaniards won the peace.
Ironically, the Aztecs were doomed not because of gunpowder, not because of steel swords, nor even because of the Spaniards' biological weapon, smallpox. They were doomed because of the relationship between them and their fellow Indians, a relationship marked by blood. The Aztecs burned out like a bright comet. They were a culture so immersed in death that they even predicted their own Armageddon. Archaeologists discovered that at the center of their calendar stone was Tonatiuh, their fifth and last sun god. At the time the Spanish arrived, the Aztecs believed they were living in their final age, and their demise would happen violently. The rubble of Templo Mayor and the sacred precinct became the building blocks of Mexico City. Eventually, the Indian and Spanish cultures fused together to become one of the most vibrant cities in the world. Today, the remains of Aztec civilization permeate Mexico City. People still practice a more benign form of their religion. The Aztec temples have crumbled, but their legacy will never be forgotten.